Welcome to Personality. I'm your host, Lori Rawlings from Lori Rawlings and Associates, and today we're going to be talking about the suicide epidemic in the construction industry and some resources for addressing it. I have several guests today who are all part of UA Local 290's Apprentice Resource Community, or ARC, who have developed some strategies over the years for intervening with folks who are considering suicide and suicide prevention. So our first guest is Phillip Clark, who recently turned out as a journeyman steam fitter. He's originally from Louisiana, but he's made Oregon his home for more than 20 years. He's an avid reader of history and nonfiction. And now that he's a journeyman, he's picked up some new hobbies like weightlifting and rock hounding. He's been a very active volunteer with Local 290 with their diversity committee, bylaws committee, and the negotiating team. And he's very happy to be able to be here today to share ARC's work on suicide prevention. Jake Klemsen is an 8th term steam fitter apprentice who is working currently at Intel as an orbital welder. He recently adopted 2 Labrador puppies that are about 3 months old and may or may not make an appearance today. I'm hoping they do. He's also a professional bowler and an avid fisherman, and that takes up most of his spare time away from work. Hendrix is also an 8th term apprentice. He's a steam fitter apprentice with UA Local 290. He entered this trade after an extraordinarily traumatic incident in his previous field caused him to look for a new career path. And the impact on his mental health of that incident left him in a pretty rough spot. And the formation of ARC has been a really life-saving call to action for him. Outside of his work and union obligations, he has a lot of hobbies that allow him to spend time focusing quietly and relaxing, including playing guitar, mountain biking, and archery. And Tori Geter holds a master's in public health and a master's in social work. And she's been working with UA Local 290 since 2013, designing, implementing, and coordinating a variety of health promotion programs for their membership, and currently is working as a psychiatric social worker at Oregon State Hospital in Salem. She's a proud mama of 3 really wonderful children, and in her spare time, she enjoys reading, walking around the neighborhood, backpacking along the Oregon coast, and traveling. So welcome, all of you. Thank you for being here. So suicide in the construction industry especially was an epidemic long before the pandemic, which has only exacerbated the risk of suicide for everyone, including construction workers. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention report the construction industry has one of the highest suicide rates compared to other industries. And they released a report in 2016 that noted the rate for suicide for men in construction and extraction occupations is 49.4 per 100,000, which is almost twice the total suicide rate for other working men. And it's 5 times greater than the rate for all fatal work-related injuries in the construction industry. Can you share with us what are some of the causes of the suicide epidemic in the construction industry?
So I can start with this. It's Phillip Clark. A big part of the causes are the work, just the nature of the work. A lot of times when we have building projects, we have a lot of hours that we work. There's a lot of overtime. Folks are working 60, 70, sometimes up to 80 hours a week for a period of time, and the work is cyclical. So you'll have one job that starts, you'll have a couple of months worth of work, and then typically you have a period where you're not working at all, and that can be extremely stressful on a lot of people. People that work in construction, they move around a lot from job to job, leaving the state, sometimes not seeing their family and friends for months to years on end, and it really tears apart a lot of families. It puts a lot of stress on the family unit, and a lot of stress on people's mental health, because their support network then is not there to assist them when they need help. And so those are some of the main factors that kind of drive the overall depression and suicidal ideation ideologies, as and addiction also runs into that as well. It's just that time being where you're constantly working, the cyclical nature of the work, the being away from friends and family and your support network for such a long period of time. um, all of those things kind of they snowball into this really uh, big epidemic that we see, which is results in such a high number of people um, completing suicide.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't really thought about how isolating the work can be if you're traveling. Um, and the unpredictability of it, I can see could cause a lot of anxiety and depression. Um, some other things I've noticed about the construction industry is the culture is very macho. Um, and there's a risk of injury too that can leave people in chronic pain. Do you, Tori? I mean, do you see those as also factors contributing to the suicide epidemic in construction?
Definitely, and I was going to chime in to add to that. Like you said, chronic pain is just a natural outcome of the work in the construction industry. And so, whenever people are living with chronic pain, that can either lead to dependence on pain medication. It can lead to self medication using alcohol or other recreational drugs, and it can also increase one's anxiety and depression. So that is definitely one of the risk factors involved with why the construction industry is at higher risk for suicide. But it's also because, like you mentioned, Lori, it is also a male dominated industry. While women actually have just in general more frequent higher rates of attempted suicide. Males are actually completing suicide at a much higher rate than females. And that's due to things that we'll probably get into a little bit later in the discussion. But men tend to use more lethal means. And that really kind of means guns. Men are using guns more frequently than women are, and so completing suicide more frequently than women are. And so when we've got a male dominated industry, we're going to see an increase in suicide because of that. The other thing about a male dominated industry is that men are less likely to seek help. Men are the helpers, men are the fixers in our society, and are less likely to reach out and maybe even recognize when they have reached a point where they desperately need help. And that will, like I said, we'll kind of get into some of the solutions around that later on in the conversation, and part of what we've been working on at Local 290.
Well, yeah, that's a great segue into talking about what Local 290 has developed in terms of a suicide prevention program. Briefly, the program, it's a training that's designed to train peer support volunteers to look for signs of suicidal behavior in others and direct potentially suicidal peers to appropriate resources. Henry, can you tell us a little bit more about the program and why you became involved in it?
Absolutely. So, the Apprentice Resource Community came together as a result of basically Tori's efforts through Local 290 to have a greater presence of peer support and suicide prevention within the local union. Specifically, when it comes to suicide intervention and prevention, our group is built around an intervention model called QPR. That's question, persuade, refer. And that's something that we have all been trained in instructing, or in the process of being trained in instructing. And that's something that we are using to basically strengthen our community as a whole, to recognize some of the signs and symptoms of suicide within our membership and know how to reach out to them.
Jake, can you tell us what are some of the signs of suicidal behavior people can be looking for in their peers and loved ones?
So there's two different kinds of signs. You've got verbal signs and nonverbal signs. Most commonly with verbal signs, you're going to have people saying things that's self-deprecating humor, or they're just simple comments like, "Don't you just wish you just didn't have to wake up in the morning?" It's stuff that somebody might have a dark sense of humor, and if you know them well enough, you might not have to worry about that being a suicidal like call for help. But if you've got somebody that doesn't typically make jokes like that, start to make jokes or say things where it really sounds like they're saying, "I wish I didn't have to wake up in the morning." If that comes out of nowhere, that's definitely a sign. It's scary because if someone's got cancer, everyone wants to help. Everyone wants to be there. It's part of our society is to take care of somebody who has this illness. But mental illness can be just as scary and just as deadly, but there's not really a community outreach for it. So when people have these feelings inside, they're not wanting to share them. So they say things with almost beating around the bush. So you really have to be paying close attention to the people you care about, your friends, your family, and see if you can pick up on some of these often very guarded clues. They're not going to be very obvious. Very small percentage of the people that are going to give you a verbal reach they're not going to say, "I'm feeling suicidal." That is very uncommon. And then as for nonverbal clues, that's if you see depression, someone who might be like a huge fan of fishing, or they love going out to the stores, or they go out on walks, and you see that they've closed themselves off from what they love. They're staying home, they're not communicating with friends, they get isolated. It's things that can happen that are out of the normal for an individual that you know well. That's often a sign that there's something going on. It may not be suicide, but suicide is definitely a possibility that they're thinking about.
You made some really great points there. I mean, number one, the signs are often so subtle because so many people are afraid to say anything when they're struggling with anxiety or depression or another mental health issue because there's a stigma associated with it. And it's also internal. I mean, you can't see people's scars, their internal scars. And so that's a really good point that you have to be really cognizant of the signs and figure out ways to suss out information so that you can help. And I think that underlines the importance of the QPR method that Henry described earlier: question, persuade, and refer. Philip, can you tell us a little bit more about how the QPR method works?
Yeah, so basically, the way the method works is if you are noticing that somebody is expressing the signs that Jacob was talking about, um, the first thing would just be to approach them and ask them a set of questions that are meant to kind of like tease out um, what's going on, what's the actual thing that's going on behind the scenes. What are we not seeing? We're seeing folks that are kind of drawing back from the things that they do on a normal basis that are part of what makes them them, um, or that they're doing these throwing out these jokes that are like, oh, I wish I didn't have to get up in the morning, or man, it would be nice to just not have to wake up again, or something like that. The first step would be to just ask the simple questions like, hey, what's going on? Is everything okay, etc. And questions like that, and maybe move on to the question, are you considering suicide, or do you have a plan for? And if they do respond positively, what's your plan? How would you complete suicide? Um, and it can be as simple as asking that question. The the thing that we know through our QPR training is that asking that question, that isn't going to put suicidal ideation into somebody's minds. The minds, that ideation is already there. They're already thinking about it, or they're not. And if they're not, then you can continue the path of questioning as into, well, so what else is going on? Because maybe it isn't that they're suicidal, but they're dealing with some really bad depression, or they're dealing with really, really bad anxiety, or their stress level has gotten, you know, beyond what they can cope with, and then you can start to push them towards the route of actually getting some mental health help for that. Now with suicide, the persuasion part, which is the P of the QPR, is to talk to them about, so if this is where they're at, that they're at the point where they're thinking about suicide and attempting suicide, persuade them to just, not for today. Let's go do something. Let's go grab a cup of coffee. Let's let's talk this thing out, because a lot of times this phase that people get into where they're ready to take the step and actually attempt suicide, this phase can last as short as 5 minutes. A life altering phase can be that short, or it can last as long as maybe an hour, but typically it's a really, really short phase. And so if you're able to stop that phase right there, you and talk to them about getting help, referring them to some help counseling, get them to the talk line, the helpline that the government has set up. um, that can be a way to kind of cut that short period of time off, and that can be what is necessary to maybe start to change their lives, to get them into a place where suicide becomes maybe not the option. Maybe the option is to maybe change some things that are going on, or get some help, get the ability to talk to somebody about what's going on inside that's causing you to feel this way.
Can I add a little bit of kind of going back? I just wanted to throw out there one of the behavioral clues that is especially confusing is when a person is acting aggressively. Um, and I've seen this so many times where I'll get a phone call from an instructor or from one of the organizers at Local 290, where a person's behavior is creating a lot of conflict. And the natural response to that is not to ask, are you okay? um, but oftentimes that is a major sign that someone is struggling with some mental health and or maybe suicidal ideation, or something that could lead to suicidal ideation. And I think that the more that we can learn to train ourselves when we come across people who are behaving aggressively or initiating conflict, the more that we can train our brains to calm down and ask how that person is doing. Ask if there's some kind of crisis in that person's life. I think the better off we can support people as well, because that is a very confusing sign that we don't often think of as a reach out for help.
That is a really good point, Tori. And it reminds me of a story that a friend of mine who works in the training center told me about an apprentice who was acting out in class a lot. And he asked, what's going on? And he just kept asking, what's going on? And finally, this apprentice broke down and told him that he was on the verge of attempting suicide. And it never would have occurred to me to just ask that question, what's going on? What's going on? And so that, that's a really good point. I mean, I think that's not a classic sign that people think about when they think about somebody who's depressed and suicidal. And it's something that people should be aware of, that any sort of unusual, out of character behavior might be something you want to pay attention to.
Exactly. Yeah, and even things like Jacob was talking about, those more subtle clues, like giving away prized possessions or animals, things that used to be important to someone. It could be nothing, right? It could be somebody just paring down, but it also could be something. And so the beauty of this QPR intervention model is that it really encourages connection. It really encourages one to ask questions about how one is doing. And as awkward as it can feel to ask someone, are you thinking about suicide? That can oftentimes be the one thing, because the person will realize, like, oh my gosh, like somebody really cares about me. um, and even if they're not thinking about suicide, just asking that question, hey, I'm curious if you're thinking about suicide, because I've been trained in the suicide prevention model, and some of the symptoms and behaviors that I'm seeing in you can, for some people, be signs that they are thinking about suicide. Even if someone's not thinking about suicide, it actually can be a doorway into having a deeper conversation, because all of a sudden that person trusts you. And we'll maybe talk about some of the things that are difficult in their life, so that we can work on preventing them from getting to that acute phase, if that was possibly the direction that they were going. And sometimes people say, yes, I actually have been thinking about suicide, and then we know which direction to go there.
That's a really good point. And it picks up on something Philip said earlier, which is asking if someone is considering suicide is not going to plant the idea in their head. But I'm wondering, and maybe Henry, you can address this. Have you had a situation where you ask some of these questions and it it escalates the situation? It enrages someone, it offends someone to the point that it becomes a difficult conversation. And if so, how do you deal with that?
If I ask what we commonly refer to as the suicide question, and it escalates somebody's behavior, it enrages them, it angers them, something of that nature, it's a little bit on me. I have a responsibility to make sure I am the right person to ask that question if I'm going to ask that question. Um, I have a responsibility, if I'm going to ask that question, to make sure the setting is appropriate to ask that question. And so, what that looks like for me, and I've actually had the pleasure of teaching this person how to perform QPR since this incident occurred, but before this individual knew how to perform a QPR, he effectively performed a QPR for me, and he saved my life. And this happened at work. And what he did was he started a conversation and a dialogue with me early on to make sure I was in the right headspace to talk to him. You know, that I was in a good mood, that things were going well for me. And he had already found a quiet and private place that he could invite me to continue that conversation. So, thus far, our conversation was just about how things were going, how the day was, hobbies and interests, things of that nature. When break rolled around and he had the opportunity, he invited me into this quiet, private place. And there he asked me more specific questions about how I was doing on a mental health sort of level. And the thing that he did there is he went to the far side of the room and he gave me the door side so I could leave at any time. And so he created and he fostered like a really safe, comfortable environment for me where I didn't feel pressure to embarrass myself in front of others or not want to talk or anything else or feel trapped. But if somebody does respond negatively to you asking that question, um, you know, that's how it's going to go sometimes. You can express to them that you have been trained in this subject matter, that you have recognized some of the signs in them, etc. Kind of stating your credentials is a good way to dispel or dissipate any bad feelings that are happening. It lets people know that you genuinely care about them, and reaffirming that you genuinely care about them is another way that you can kind of help reassure them that you're there for them and you do care. That being said, if a person is angry and they want to leave, that's their right and that's their choice. What you can do from there is you can try to find a person that might be better to approach them. Somebody who's a closer friend or a family member, somebody who has a better rapport with that individual so that they can reach out to them and you can provide support. If, let's say, you are trained in performing QPR and this other individual isn't, you can provide all the background support to that individual as they are effectively performing a QPR in your place for this person that you have concerns about.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you so much for sharing your own story, because I think the more people who share stories about their personal history with thoughts of suicide, the more it removes the stigma for it, and allows these conversations to take place. And so I really appreciate you being open about your history. So one other item I want to just circle back on. We've used the term suicidal ideation quite a bit so far in this conversation, and I'm wondering if Tori, can you just define that for us a little quickly and give us some examples of what suicidal ideation might look like?
Oh, sure. And I'll just be transparent here. I don't know what like the official definition is, but I can give you an idea of what it is. I've never actually looked up what is the definition of suicidal ideation, but essentially suicidal ideation are like when a person has the sometimes fleeting and sometimes chronic thought of, I don't want to be here anymore. What would things be better off? Would my family be better off? Would any number of things be better off if I weren't here? It's the thoughts of dying, the thoughts of taking one's life without a plan. So really, I think that when we talk about suicidal ideation, we're differentiating between the act of attempting, right? The difference between suicidal ideation and suicide attempt is what we're differentiating between. So someone can actually live with suicidal ideation for years or even a lifetime without ever making an attempt. And it's actually pretty common. A lot of people live their lives experiencing periodically or chronic suicidal ideation without ever having a plan and without ever making an attempt. I think it's more common than we even know, because those are just, the numbers that we wouldn't ever have. And so when we talk about suicidal ideation, we're talking about those thoughts. Versus like Phil alluded to earlier, one of the things that we are trained in through this model is when we ask someone, are you thinking about suicide? Do you have suicidal ideation? And a person says yes. The next question is, do you have a plan? Because it's the having a plan and having access to lethal means that really puts a person at very increased risk for attempting a suicide and possibly completing a suicide.
We talked a little bit about the lethal means that people have access to. And Tori, you mentioned guns as a major source of lethal means. But Jake, maybe can you tell us a little bit more about some of the other lethal means that people should be aware of when they're, maybe thinking about talking to a peer or a loved one about whether they're having suicidal thoughts and whether they have a plan?
Okay, absolutely. So there's a lot of lethal means. The first thing I do want to touch base on is a gun, because it is the most lethal mean that creates most of the suicides that are completed in our nation and in the world. If you have a friend that is an avid hunter and he gets a gun, that's not a red flag. He's a gun-toting individual who has had guns in his life his entire life. But if you have a friend that's verbally expressed a disinterest in guns, they've not wanted guns around them, and then that friend decides to get a gun, that's a red flag. That's someone you may want to ask the question, hey, is everything okay? Are you thinking about suicide? Because that person's at a much higher risk for using that gun for personal use versus recreational use. But outside of guns, other lethal means, like for women, it's overdose on medications is the main use. For men, it's firearm. So if someone's hoarding prescription pills and not using them regularly, if you find a 3-month supply of something in their drawer, that is a huge red flag, and you may want to ask the question. Other lethal means are just sharp objects, knives, things like that. People try to slit wrists. Um, there's, I mean, there's going to be a knife in every single person's kitchen. So if that's the means that they're thinking of, that's not something you can really recognize. But the thing that I wanted to bring up in this regard is not only are suicide something that we can track, but there's also suicides we cannot track. Like that single car accident that happened at 1 a.m. in the morning where they hit a tree. You don't necessarily know if that person aimed for the tree or if it was in fact an accident. There's so many things like that that can happen where lethal means were with a motor vehicle and it was used for suicide, but there's no way for us to distinguish if it was in fact a suicide or not. So you kind of have to look at the world around you and realize that any possible way that you could kill yourself is a lethal means that someone who is thinking about suicide could potentially come up with.
Wow. That's a really good point. I mean, there are a lot of different ways that people could complete suicidal thoughts. And so just being aware of some of the most common ones and how they break down by gender is a good resource to have in your back pocket if this is something that you are uh, endeavoring to have a conversation about. So, I mean, this work that you're doing, it's obviously incredibly important, but it's also very, I would imagine, time consuming and emotionally draining. And so I'm wondering if each of you can tell us a little bit about why you chose to become involved in suicide prevention. And so, Philip, I'd like to start with you. If you could tell us a little bit about why you chose to do this work.
So, I mean, my involvement in it started, I guess, pretty early on in the apprenticeship. Um, we had we had an apprentice who was pretty late term, who completed suicide, and I want to say within a short period of time, maybe 6 months or so, we had another late term apprentice, almost ready to turn out, who was in a horrible motor vehicle accident and passed away. And there was a lot of pain in the apprenticeship at that time. There were a lot of people who had all these questions about, like, could I have prevented that? Could I have been the one that saved that person's life? And I these a lot of these people were people that I knew pretty well and that I cared about, and I just felt like I did not have the ability to help them at all. That if it was me putting myself in their shoes, I wouldn't have known what to do either. And so I felt like I really needed some training. I needed some guidance. Um, and it made me want to help them out, and it made me want to help out people that I've experienced a couple of friends that have completed suicide um, earlier on in my life, and I these were incidents where I was complete. I knew the person very, very well, I thought, um, and it just caught me completely off guard, and so I felt for those other apprentices because I was also having the same questions, like what signs did I miss? What could I have done? Like, could I have, if I was just more aware of what was going on, could I have saved this person's life? And so that's what really led me to this, to being a part of the Apprentice Resource Community, was just, I wanted to be that person to step in and to help. Um, and then the second we started getting going with this, then you start learning about the statistics and how common it is in our industry, and that just made me want to do this even more.
Thank you for sharing that. And you're right. I mean, it's so common that there probably isn't a single trades worker or person somehow affiliated with the construction trades who hasn't been touched by suicide. Um, it's tragic, the scale of it. Um, Tori, can you tell us a little bit more about how you became involved in the work?
There's a lot of layers. So I'll start just by saying that definitely this work is personal for me. I have had a very dear family member die by suicide. I personally have struggled with depression and anxiety over the course of my life, and so it is personal. But when I started working for Local 290, and entered into the field of public health and social work, the goal is to work towards improving individuals' quality of life and save lives, right? And when I learned, it was that event that Phillip described at Local 290 that kind of coincided with a member who had asked me, who had actually brought to me the QPR model. He had taken a training and he asked if I would bring it to the wellness program. I had previously exclusively been working on wellness programming stuff that related to fitness and nutrition types of, the typical wellness programming type of things. So we had our first QPR training with the retired members of Local 290. And within a couple of months, that crisis event happened at Local 290, where there was a death of an apprentice by suicide that really sent the training center and the union spinning. And the director of training at the time came to me and asked, I don't know what to do, but I know that there's something that we can do. Can you please work on this? And so it was at that point in time that that really launched me into digging into understanding mental health promotion and suicide prevention on a community level. And with that first QPR training that we held, there were approximately, I think at that time we were having in-person attendance, this is pre-COVID, about 120 retired Local 290 members in attendance. I was really, really nervous to bring a suicide prevention training to the construction industry, to a community, majority men over the age of 60. I had no idea how it was going to go over. Thought maybe they would just throw tomatoes at me and send me packing. But what actually happened is that after the class, a line out the door, a line so long that it went out the door, people lined up to talk to the instructor. People wanted to share their stories. And it was through that experience that I realized, contrary to what we like to believe about mental health and suicide, we think that people don't want to talk about these things. We are led to believe that these are things that we just keep taboo. These are things that we keep behind closed doors within families. It's not true. People want to talk about it. And it's because every human being alive has experienced, either personally or through their network of, through their social networks or work friends, everybody has experienced mental health, mental illness, and suicide in some capacity. And a lot of people have close experience with suicide. And it's confusing and it's painful. And so it was through that I started working heavily. And the more that I did, the more that I investigated and I started bringing more trainings in, the more I started training myself, the more I realized that we were onto something here with the construction industry. This was before the CDC document came out that showed us that the construction industry was at increased risk. And so I started working with the union leadership and with the training leadership and bringing more and more of these QPR trainings to the union. And so it was really because I saw that there was a need. And the need was so obvious. I only just had to scratch the surface to see that people were really wanting to talk about these things and really wanting to know how to help their loved ones, how to help themselves, how to help their community.
That's so inspiring to hear that, you were able to open the door to get people just to talk about these things, because I would have made the same assumption that people don't want to talk about these things, especially men, and especially men who work in the construction industry, where you're trained from day one that you need to be tough and not complain. So that's really eye opening.
And I want to just add to that, specifically to the ARC peer support program, which we started planting the seeds for building this program in 2019. As a public health practitioner, part of my job is to work myself out of a job, right? And so I knew that because I contract and I consult for Local 290. I am not a construction worker. I am not a Local 290 member. It was super important for me to build the internal infrastructure that would allow for Local 290 to be able to respond to crisis, prevent, create a network of people who could prevent and work on these intervention models without me there. So that really is the goal of every public health practitioner, is to work themselves out of a job, because we want the culture to change such that we're no longer needed, right? And so, yeah, I just wanted to add that piece, because that is an important part of the ARC program, is that it is a peer-led and peer inspired program.
So yeah, picking up on that, Jake, can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to become involved in this peer-led suicide prevention work?
Yeah. Before I ever joined ARC, I had suicide thrown kind of at me twice in my life. Neither individual that was suicidal ended up completing suicide. So both of those people are still with us today. But without any training, I kind of was the person that these individuals had reached out to. And I was just flying by the seat of my pants trying to figure out what I could do to help, without the knowledge that I really needed to know that I was saying the right thing. That's the proven right way to go to combat these situations. So just knowing the panic that I was in those moments, because when you pick up that phone call and someone lets you know that they're feeling suicidal and you don't know what to say, but you know you can't hang up the phone, it's terrifying. It was two of the scariest nights of my life. One, I ended up leaving the house, meeting an individual at a park so that they could drive 20 minutes and I could drive 20 minutes. And luckily, just that drive, knowing that he was meeting me, helped get him out of the acute phase. And he was a much different person when we were talking in person than he was on the phone. That individual had a gun in the trunk of their car and they were planning on using it on themselves. The other one had a gun as well that I just convinced her to have her neighbor take the gun for the night. I did all of that one over the phone, but again, I was just thinking on the fly, like, if I was in their shoes feeling this way, what could I do to make it so that I don't have access to the means or get out of the situation? And that was just an instinct mode. But again, I would never want to go through that kind of situation where someone's life is depending on me and not have the information that I have now through the QPR trainings that we've done. I think, if anything, it's just given me a much more confidence to be able to handle these types of situations, because suicide is a silent lurker. It's always around. There's, like, in every neighborhood, you're going to have somebody around you that's thinking of suicide that you don't know that they're thinking of suicide. And oftentimes you will either never know, or you'll know at the last minute when they tell you, when they need you in that acute phase. And you just kind of have to react and be ready to help in any way you can. So this added information we have is, I find it as valuable as anything I've ever learned in my life. And so I just, I guess like CPR, the more people know CPR makes the community a safer place. I just like teaching QPR so that there's more people that understand what to look for and how to help, so that our community is a safer place.
That's amazing. And you make a really great point there, that a lot of times, whether you have the training or not, people are going to come to you with suicidal thoughts. especially if you work in the construction industry, it's bound to happen at some point or another that somebody that you work with or care about is going to be in crisis. And so the more prepared you can be to actually help in a situation like that, the better off you'll be. So thank you for making that point. Henry, can you tell us a little bit more about why you became involved in doing this work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've kind of touched on this a little bit earlier on, but because of Tori's efforts with the training center and Local 290, first night of class, second term apprentice, I received a QPR training from Andy Cartmill, who went on to mentor us through our training to instruct QPR. He's awesome. Anyhow, going through that QPR training that night and sitting in that room with all these apprentices, and specifically going through the slides that talked about all of the warning signs, the clues, the symptoms, things like that, and realizing like, whoa, I'm all of these things and more. All these feelings I'm having, I'm like a suicide risk, right? And I recognized I had some work to do. So in that, at the end of that training, we had the opportunity that if we wanted to maybe further our involvement with peer support and suicide prevention within Local 290, to provide some contact information, which I did. And going forward, that experience of that QPR at the hall really prepared me to talk to that individual who pulled me aside at work, and it really gave me the tools to open up to him in a way. Like I kind of recognize, hey, I know what he's doing here. All right, let's take advantage of this. And that's something that really seems to stand true. We talk about the construction industry and male-dominated industry. We're the fixers. We're the people that others go to for help. But really what it is that with my mental health specifically, the problem that needed to be addressed was identified for me. And the tools that were available were shown to me. And I went to work and I fixed my mental health. And if that worked for me, it must work for a lot of similar minded people in the construction trades. And so when the opportunity to be involved with Local 290 and specifically with ARC to bring this to as many people possible, it was like, that's it. I can show them the job they have to do, and I can give them the tools. That's it. We're builders. We're fixers. Let's go to work.
That is a great analogy, and I think it's one that will really resonate with a lot of our listeners who are in the construction trades. Approaching it just like any other construction issue really makes a lot of sense. So speaking of that, how can people who are members of Local 290 who are interested in joining you in this work become involved in working with ARC or otherwise preventing suicide?
One of the things that I really wanted to add before I forgot this is it's extremely important to understand the peer-to-peer support part of this. Tori kind of touched on this a little bit, but the fact that we are working side by side with our peers, we're construction workers, they're construction workers, we're pipe fitters, they're pipe fitters. That is so key to why this program is so successful, because it breaks down that barrier of that person that is more of a health professional versus the guy that works with his hands. Well, we're also the guys and gals that work with our hands. We're also the people that are putting in the pipe. We're the welders. We're the fitters. We're that guy that's right next to them at the tool talk in the morning every day, 6 o'clock. Rubbing our eyes and guzzling coffee to get going for the morning. That connection and that bond that we already have, it breaks down so many barriers. And so I just wanted to highlight that the peer-to-peer part, that is pure unadulterated genius, because that really, if there's anything that you can do to break down that wall, to break down that barrier, having the guy next to you, the gal next to you that's working with the tools, that's the way you break down that barrier. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to just throw that out there. That is a really good part of this program.
Can I just tag onto that real quick, Phil? Sorry. I just wanted to add the piece about like, if you think about how much time you spend of your waking hours with the people that you work with, you actually spend more time with the people that you work with than you do with your family at home or with your friends at home. And so your colleagues actually know you really, really well. And so that relationship, but also the familiarity with whether or not, like with being able to identify if somebody's behavior is off, is often first identified at work, before it's even identified with friends and family.
And by the way, don't feel bad about interjecting that, Philip. That's great stuff. Um, so people who in the audience who are 290 members or members of other trades, how can they become involved in doing this kind of suicide prevention work?
So there are a lot of, I mean, we're really, really fortunate in the Portland metro area. There are so many wonderful resources out there for folks that aren't members of UA 290, that are just members of the community that want to get involved. There is through Washington County is where we've gotten most of our training. They have a lot of resources and a lot of wonderful trainings, a lot of people that are really willing to help. If you're a member of 290, you can get in contact with me or Tori or any of the members of ARC, and we're more than happy to bring new people on. You can get in touch with anybody in the training center. You can get in touch with anybody at the union office. Everybody knows who we are. They know about our program. A lot of them have actually gone through our QPR training and are trained to help, and they will get you in contact. So literally reach out to anybody at the union that's associated with UA 290, and they will get you in contact with ARC.
And I'll just add what Phil was alluding to with there's actually an organization in the Portland Tri-County area called Get Trained to Help. And they offer free classes related to mental health and suicide prevention. They offer QPR, they offer another training called CALM, that's counseling on access to lethal means. They offer mental health first aid. There's a number of those trainings, and I think a lot of them are still available through Zoom. So even if you're outside of the Tri-County area, I believe that you can register for those trainings. If you are outside of the Tri-County area, you can get in touch with QPR Institute, the QPR Institute, to find trainers in your area if they exist. If they exist, oftentimes there are trainers in other counties that you can bring a training into your workplace.
And I will make sure that links to the resources you've described are in the show notes for this episode, so that folks who are interested in learning more and getting involved can look directly at some of those resources. We've talked a lot about the peer-to-peer aspect of it, but are there things that employers can be doing to help address the suicide epidemic?
The construction industry has a lot of naturally existing protective factors that exist that really lend well to a suicide prevention strategy. Safety strategies. So suicide prevention can be built right into the zero injury safety strategies that exist in the construction industry. Training, right? Like plumbers, HVAC professionals, pipe fitters, you all have to be trained to maintain your licensure annually or biannually, things like that. So including training that addresses suicide prevention and mental health just as a natural part of the safety package, just like CPR and first aid are required to keep those certifications current. Include mental health first aid, include QPR in those training packages, because really what it boils down to is culture change, right? There was a time in the construction industry when personal protective gear was not a thing. And then there was a culture change that happened. And I believe, although I don't spend much time on construction sites, but I believe that you can't enter a construction site as a worker if you're not wearing your personal protective gear. So that's what we're talking about here. Like, let's make the construction industry an industry that includes mental health and suicide prevention in that safety strategy. Let's make it normal to talk about, like, hey, I'm not feeling well. Hey, I need help. Let's encourage workers and members to seek help when they need it, and everybody to identify when that help is needed.
That's a really good point. This is a safety issue, not only in terms of preventing fatalities, but I mean, if you think about it, workers who are anxious, depressed, and otherwise in crisis are going to be distracted. And that creates the opportunity for all kinds of safety hazards on a job site. If you have someone who's dealing with suicidal thoughts and working with power tools or working on a ladder, that's just a recipe for a safety incident. So I think the more that employers can think of this as a safety issue, the more incentive it will give them to really take a more active role in preventing suicide.
And quite honestly, it's a productivity issue too, right? If you've got workers who are dragging because they have financial stress or mental stress or struggling with addiction, at home, everything that's happening in one's personal life is coming to work, right? And so there certainly is a business case for these strategies as well.
Well, wonderful. We've covered a lot of ground here, but I'm wondering if there's anything any of you want to add that you think our listeners should be aware of in regards to any of these issues.
As always, I would like to reassure our listeners that there are a multitude of resources out there available in any county you might live in Oregon or Washington. They are free. They're there. They're easy to find on the internet. If that isn't something that's accessible to you, there are national hotlines that you can call. One of the numbers would be 1-800-273-8255. That's 1-800-273-TALK. Or you can just text hello to 741-741. It's right there 24/7. If you're ever feeling like you need some help, it's available.
Thank you so much, Henry, for sharing that help is really just a phone call or a text away. So don't hesitate if you're in crisis.
I would like to add that, part of what's going on in our culture in America in general and in the construction industry in particular is that we are working on kind of expanding who we are as a trade by adding more women and minorities into the mix, and that is incredibly important, believe it or not, to mental health and to getting people used to having access to mental health. One of the things that happens in our industry a lot is that we get sort of in this echo chamber kind of a mindset where we have like the very toxic parts of that masculinity, like, the only emotion you have is anger. That's the only one you're allowed to express. You're not allowed to be sad or have problems or complain about anything. Having a dynamic and diverse workforce can kind of help to break up that echo chamber a little bit. So getting more women and minorities into our trades can literally help to save people's lives by bringing down the temperature a little bit, and also being that person that is a peer support person, a person that is open and willing to say, yes, I have had struggles with mental health. This is what I've done. Getting help is a very positive thing, and it has helped me in my life. Being that positive person that has a different message can break through some of that toxicity that's in our construction culture, and can be, especially if you're that person and you have those resources, you can be that easy bridge that gets somebody out of that depression, out of the anxiety, that helps move them towards getting the help that they need so that they don't think that suicide is their only option. So it's really key to, if we want to be that cultural change, that we have to embrace bringing more people into our circle, people that are different, that have different perspectives and different ways of thinking and different ways of seeing the world. So
Yeah. Thank you so much, Philip. That's really inspiring.
I appreciate what you added, Phil and Henry. I'm really glad that you brought that hotline number. And I'll add too that nationwide, I believe it's happening in July. We are getting a national mental health suicide prevention hotline, much like 911. That number will be 988. So it will be a standardized call that anyone in any state in any county can just dial 988 and reach support that will triage you to your regional area. I think it's important for your listeners and for the construction industry to remember that suicide is about pain. A person who is having thoughts of suicide and who has a plan of suicide actually believes that it is a good idea to not be alive anymore, actually believes that them not being alive anymore will remove a sense of burdensomeness from their loved ones' lives. So it requires a different way of thinking about suicide. Oftentimes we want to have a response of, don't do anything stupid. Why would you do that kind of thing? But when we realize that for a person who is experiencing this level of pain, actually suicide is not stupid. Suicide is the best decision. And so orienting ourselves away from thinking that it's a stupid thing to realizing that suicide is really just about pain, and it's just a way for a person to intervene by providing connection to an individual. And like we've talked about in this interview, if you are someone who is experiencing pain, whether it be having suicidal ideations, a plan, or other just types of conflict and pain in your life, really, I encourage you to just reach out and seek some help. And that can be from anyone from your coworker to a family member to a pet to calling the National Suicide Prevention Line, to a church pastor. There are a lot of people out there who are willing to help, and your life matters.
Thank you so much, Tori. Thank you so much for those inspiring words. And thank you to all of you for all of the work you're doing to address this epidemic. It's making a difference, and I want to make sure you all know that. For those in the audience who are listening and want to make a difference or are experiencing suicidal thoughts, please know that there are resources available, either to help you or to allow you to help others. So Philip, Jake, Tori, and Henry, thank you again for being here today and for all the work that you do.